First off, could you talk a bit about who you are and what motivated you to start Disability History Month?
Yeah, my name's Richard Rieser. I'm a disabled man. I'm in my 70s now. I was a teacher and advisor for inclusion in an inner London borough. I then moved on to set up a disability charity called Disability Equality and Education, which ran for 14 years, but then was no more money as government changed its mind, so there was no more funding in that area in the early 2008. And after that, I set up World of Inclusion as a consultancy, where I do training on inclusion and disability equality, both in the UK and around the world. So I've done a lot of that. I was doing the training in Leeds in early 2010. And there were people training, it was on all areas of equality. There were people there from Schools Out, LGBT, approach, and also Black History Month. And they said, isn't it about time we had a Disability History Month? And Richard, you're the person who can do it. And so I called a meeting of lots of organizations, trade unions, TUC, disability organizations run by disabled people, but also organizations for like Scope and RNIB and a few others. And in the end, we had about 80 organizations all signed up to our principles. The principles were that we would be a social model organization. And for your listeners, if they don't know what that means, it means that we see our biggest problem as disabled people, whether we have physical, sensory, mental impairments, psychosocial, it doesn't matter. Our biggest problem is not our impairment. Our biggest problem is societal attitudes and the resulting infrastructure and environment that comes from that, and the way that institutions and organizations operate. We call that disableism, a systematic prejudice towards people who are physically or mentally different. And it is still strong and alive in our society, despite legislation, because the mindset change, and if you like, people feeling embarrassed about holding such attitudes does not exist in the same way as it exists for people who have racism, people who are homophobic or Islamophobic. It's not the same. And we don't see that as something that is taken seriously. So then the Conservative government came in and basically seemed to be saying we're going to reverse most of the things that have happened over the last previous years. And we thought it was important on that basis to launch Disability History Month. And we have three key things that we are trying to do, which is recognise the achievements of disabled people despite the barriers that are created, looking back in history and learning the lessons of how we have been treated in the past and what we can learn from that to go forward, and to champion disability equality in all areas of society. So that was really how it came to be, and that was 13 years ago. Since then, people can look on our website, which is UKDHM.org, and they will find for each year we've had a different theme, and we produce a broadsheet and a whole lot of resources, mainly aimed at education, but also aimed at the community and the workplace, so people can have discussions and change the practices. And there are practices that need to be changed. There are duties that all service providers, employers, and anyone who provides something, whether it be a club or a trade union or a political party, they all have to comply with the Equality Act, and particularly the disability equality elements of that. And we find that it's more honoured in the breach than in the implementation. And people seem to want to clap on the back when they've done the slightest little thing, like putting a ramp in, without thinking of access and movement throughout the whole building for people who are ambulance impaired, for instance, or they put a speaking lift in, but then they don't have any other speaking symbols anywhere in their building, or people put Braille on doors when very, very few blind people use Braille. They would be much easier if there was a button that just spoke to you where you were going to go. I think only about 3% of blind people actually use Braille. So the idea that if you put Braille buttons in that you've done it, there's a complete ignorance really when it comes to employers. And fundamentally, there are still over 1 million disabled people who won't work and are not getting it despite government efforts. And they have made some small inroads over the last 12 years. But at the same time as that, what they've been doing is cutting back on basics that disabled people rely on to live on. And so in the swings and roundabouts, are disabled people better off or not as a result of what we've been doing over the last 12 years? I'd say they're worse off. I think there's more exposure in advertising, for instance. There are more disabled people featuring in advertising now, though still very few, and I think the Broadcasters Network last year identified only about 2% of output on the 5 terrestrial channels as featuring disabled people, when we're 24% of the population, according to the latest census. So they've got a long way to go. Everybody's got a long way to go. But we think by digging down into the roots of where the prejudice and discrimination comes from, there's a better chance of people understanding it, because we look back at people in the medieval period or the Roman and Greek period and think, well, how did they do that? You know, killing disabled babies as a matter of course. We don't do things like that, or do we? You know, because we have people campaigning to end their lives, which would amount to killing of disabled people. And, you know, I think there's a lot of food for thought needed about that. This is not an individual decision. This is something people are asking from the state. And once the state has those powers, as we've seen from around the world, they can be used in a negative way for disabled people. So we connect all of these different things. The theme this year is disability, health, and well-being. And you can understand why we've gone for that. The evidence more and more is coming out from looking at the period of the COVID pandemic that it was disabled people who took the brunt of that. Sure, lots of people were impacted, but in terms of fatalities, disabled people had the highest levels of fatality. And when it came to young people with learning difficulties, that was 18 times higher fatality rate than the rest of the population. These things show that what the government has said they're doing isn't actually happening. They haven't taken on board the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which they ratified in 2009. And so, you know, we think that the reasons why that happened need to be explained during this year's History Month, but we need to extend it looking backwards at how disabled people have been treated. We also need to look at how welfare wasn't provided for people during that period. It was just removed by diktat with the COVID Act, just took it away, so that people who rely on social services and care support just didn't get it anymore. And no provision was made for providing food, medicines, or even getting people out of bed and for caring for them. You know, some local authorities did make a good effort at it, but in a lot of places they didn't. And then the callous way that government, particularly in the UK, but this happened in other places as well, characterised that we would go for herd immunity. Well, herd immunity means that the people who are at greater risk, which the government tended to call vulnerable, like it was all our own fault, no, we were at greater risk of getting COVID. We were not protected. We were not given extra support. The people they decided were vulnerable were only a small percentage of disabled people who were actually at risk. And what did they do then? In the early stages, we had medical profession backed by government putting out advice that if there was a shortage of ventilators, then it shouldn't be disabled people who got the ventilators. In other words, we should be allowed to die. Or the use of do not resuscitate notices became much wider, which again is a breach of our human rights. We have every right to survive as much as anybody else, and it's written into that convention. Or the most crass and ridiculous thing, care homes which are full of disabled people. You don't go to a care home unless you're disabled. So people might say, well, they're just old. Well, they're old people who have physical or mental impairments, such as Alzheimer's. Therefore, they are disabled people. People who are able to manage in society still live in the community. Lots of old age pensioners. So it's not just about age, it's about disability. So the idea that you should discharge people from hospitals because of the acute need into the homes where all these people were living amounted to corporate manslaughter, in my view. And I think the government should be charged on that out of this inquiry that is currently going on. How anybody could have taken such a decision is beyond belief. So there is a lot of culpability around, which the government tends to hide behind, saying, well, we rolled out the vaccine. Yes, you did. But we have 178,000 people who are dead, and a very substantial proportion of them are disabled people. So you've saved £5 billion on pension costs. Great for you. You know, that's not really what it's about. And so that's a reason why we need to challenge thinking. And the fundamental flaw in government thinking is they see this as an individual problem, our impairment. We reject that in the same way as the United Nations has rejected it. And they say that disability is a combination of people having an impairment with the barriers in society. Now, our Equality Act does not say that. Our Equality Act is a medical model definition, and it says people who can't carry out normal day-to-day activities. It goes on to say that we have a right to reasonable adjustments. Well, where were the reasonable adjustments over COVID? And what about the public duty? Section 149 of the Equality Act says all public bodies have a duty to promote disability equality and prevent discrimination and harassment. Well, where was that being exercised during the COVID crisis? So we can see that it brought out in sharp relief the long systematic problems that we've been highlighting in our society. So going back into history, what about welfare? Well, for a long time, it seems that in our society, people were just accepted for who they were. There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that either in, say, the medieval period, if you were really ill and you couldn't manage, then you would go to a monastery, and there was a Christian duty to give to those who were worse off than you yourself. And so the monasteries did that. People who had leprosy were looked after in leper houses run by monks and nuns throughout the country. And the leprosy really only came here from the Crusaders who brought it back, and it spread like wildfire around the country. Then we've had other things like the plague. Well, you can't stop plagues when they come, but that still decimated the population very considerably. And as a result, labour power and the breakdown of the feudal system, which was a result of what was called, in quotes, the Black Death or the plague, and several episodes of it in the 13th century, meant that ordinary people had much more weight to argue for some rights and for actually getting a wage rather than just being paid in a bit of kind for their labour power by being tied to the land. So the feudal system was partly begun to be broke down by an unknown pandemic in the 13th century, and that led to all sorts of social unrest and much more draconian laws about people who were begging and moving about, so that they were actually returned to the land that they came from. They were put in the stocks and so on. And out of that also came and said, well, what about people who have not brought this about on themselves? Not though one could question whether anyone had brought it about on themselves. The less fortunate, the old and the infirm, as they called them in those days, which were disabled people. Well, there began to be some beginnings of giving support at the local level, particularly after the Reformation, when that structure I just talked about was broken down. The monasteries were taken over, and the government and the Royal Exchequer took all the wealth from that. They didn't put back an infrastructure that was there, so there was nothing left. And so suddenly they had to begin to come in with something. So we get the Elizabethan Poor Law that comes in, and we see the distinction already between the worthy poor, i.e. the old and the infirmed, and the unworthy poor, i.e. those work-shy shirkers who should be working. And they got much less support. And there was the parish poor house, and people were given money from a tax, a local tax that people had to be collected under poor law. And that went on for about 250 years. During most of that time, disabled people were just in the community with a bit of extra support. And of course, other people would have supported them as well. These are both physical and people with learning difficulty, or indeed with mental health issues. They all seem to be largely contained within the community. In the 18th century, we begin to see, with the age of enlightenment, the age of unenlightenment at the same time. And the age of unenlightenment was that anyone who was different from the norm should be put away somewhere different. And we began to see local madhouses being set up, first of all paid for by the richer people. And then in the 19th century, people began to see as a threat to the growing industrialized, commercialized society, and they began to be locked away. And we have the Lunacy Act of 1808, which places people away. And then by 1845, every county in the UK had to have a pauper asylum where people were placed on the say-so of a doctor. So this was also part of the growth of the medical profession, who became the gatekeepers of who should go into these places or not. There was also the threat following the French Revolution. There was huge fear amongst the upper classes in Britain that something similar would happen. And so they wanted to deal with this in a very draconian way. And when there was problems with harvest and other things, the 1834 Poor Law reform was brought in, and this meant that you could only get the reform if the support if you went to a physical place called a workhouse and stayed there. Now, they were set up for people who the new industrial class thought were not wanting to go and work in their factories. And why would you, working 12, 14 hours a day for not very much? But people did, and huge numbers of people moved from the country to the towns, and we suddenly had this urban problem of the urban poor, and so the poorhouse became the place that they were put. By 1860, and we know this because of census information, the majority populations of these draconianly run workhouses, and the work was inane and stupid, like unpicking tallowed rope, and you did it all day long for no good reason because nothing was done with it, or breaking up stones. So it wasn't actually very useful work. It wasn't even sewing mailbags, as people did in prison a few years later. But if you didn't do that, and this included old people and the disabled people who were there, by 1860, they were the majority. And that continued until they were shut down with the welfare reforms of 1945. So that's where people were segregated. One other thing happened to segregate people historically. The people who were largely called, and these I put in quotes, idiots and imbeciles, were already being locked away in these asylums and the workhouse, which often had its own ward for people with mental health or learning difficulties. But a growing number of people, misreading Darwin's philosophy, said we need to actually breed a better human being. So they looked around and they saw the poverty in the cities, which had largely been created by the low wages and uncertainty of work, and said, well, these people, look, they're having more babies than others, and they're drunk, and there's more prostitution and more crime. So it's something to do with something inside their brain, which of course it wasn't. It was a socially created thing. But they began to say, well, there's about 10% of the population who shouldn't be allowed to breed. And we call them the feeble-minded, or in America, they call them morons. This was an actual word which young people use that they shouldn't do. And that was the eugenics movement. And they campaigned and campaigned. They got a royal commission in 1904 that reported in 1908. There was some doubt about how it should be dealt with. So a 1911 bill came up in Parliament, which argued for sterilization of this group of people. And there was a new test that could tell who these people were. It was called intelligence test. Now, you talk to anybody who knows about intelligence tests, and you can teach a test and you can change people's scores. It's a culturally based thing, and it doesn't really tell you very much, and it's only measuring one of what are now known as 8 different intelligences. So it was very skewed. But still, this was brought about by a Frenchman called Binet, he did it for the French government to sort out who should be educated and who should not in France. And it was taken up by eugenicists, Goddard in the United States. And here we had a number of leading eugenicists. And in fact, the first chair of eugenics at University College London was set up. So this became a real movement, and all the intellectuals of the day, both of the right and of the left, people like the Webbs, who founded London School of Economics, H.G. Wells, D.H. Lawrence, were all signed up to this idea of getting rid of the people who were inferior. And this was very popular right up until it was put into practice by Hitler in Germany, and then people saw the results of it. Our darkest time, if you like, was under the Germans with compulsory sterilization. 300,000 Germans sterilized. But remember, before that happened, in America, there were 62,000 who'd been compulsory sterilized in 34 states. That was what was put up in 1911 and was defeated. Churchill, as Home Secretary, put it forward, and it was defeated. The eugenicists regrouped and said, well, we won't do that. We'll put them away in long-stay hospitals. And so that went through in 1913, with only one man articulating against it, someone called Wedgwood, who was arguing against it on human rights grounds, that we shouldn't do this to anybody. Only 15 MPs voted against this, and it went through. It was stopped by the First World, which is quite interesting, because many of those feeble-minded people had to go and work in the factories because the men had gone off to war. In 1919, they were then placed in long-stay hospitals. So where was their mental incapacity there? So it was a socially defined thing, and these people lost their lives, a lost generation, sometimes there for 60 years until they came out. And they were sex segregated rather than being sterilized, so they were not allowed to mix with the women who were in different wings. They were allowed to dance where they were measured how near they were to the other person, all totally socially controlled, and they were infantilized throughout their whole lives. When we came to close those down, those people are now living in the community with support, although much affected by austerity, not getting the same support they used to, showing that it was never necessary to put those people away. So it's important to learn the lessons of this history so that we actually understand now, this very day that we're going to be launching on 2017, Mr. Sunak will bring forward his new budget, and we think there's going to be quite a lot of austerity there. And if you look at which areas they're going to cut, it's going to be the social services budget again, which will mean cuts to those very people who are living in the community and rely on their support so that they can have a reasonable life. So what we'll be saying on that night is human rights, not austerity. So the message, as you can see, is to bring an analysis of the past to the present and argue for the future.
I know you mentioned the CRPD, the convention.
Yeah.
I've just finished my master's, and I looked at that and the changes that we've seen since that was introduced. What, in your opinion, have you noticed has changed in disability rights since the introduction of that convention?
Not much. I think we were more influenced by what was going on in Europe when we were part of Brexit. For instance, the Labour government back in the 2012-14, there was a directive, a European directive on employment, and Labour wanted to limit that to employers over 20. And the European directive said, no, it must apply to everyone. So that meant that the requirements of reasonable adjustment, of non-discrimination, were extended to all areas. So that had a big influence. The passenger rail directive, the bus directive, again, the Disability Discrimination Act, which was only going to be implemented in 2017 for new buses. Suddenly they had to do it for many more, and that was introduced 20 years ago. So Europe had more impact, which was one of the reasons, of course, why the Brexiteers wanted to leave, because they didn't want all this red tape. One person's red tape is someone else's rights, and people need to realize that. So there's been a reticence from, it was signed in 2009 by the dying Labour government, and they did bring in the Equality Act with more things in it. That was watered down by the coming in Tory government, and they have shown no signs of actually incorporating it. In fact, to the extent that they attacked people's fundamental rights, Linda Burnett from DIPAC took a personal complaint using the optional protocol to the UN CRPD committee in Geneva, and they found after a 2-year investigation that the British government or the UK government was guilty of gross violations of the convention, and have required them to report every year back to them, and they haven't seen any improvements. So there's a conscious effort, and the government hides behind the amount of money they spend on disability benefits. But we're not talking about benefits, and they have reduced that as much as they can, but it's gone up with inflation and the increase in the number of disabled people. 14.5 million now under the Equality Act definition. So in terms of actually introducing the rights into British law, they have not incorporated the convention. It can be used in the higher courts, such as the appeal court, as an arbiter, but it cannot be used in our local courts and tribunals. And so it is not part of British law as it is practiced most of the time. And therefore, that really needs to be fully incorporated. Both the Scottish and Welsh devolved administrations want it, but there's an argument there about subsidiarity. Actually, it was the UK that signed it, and we're not sure that either Wales or Scotland can actually do it on their own. So what we need is a government that will incorporate it. Most countries around the world have. They haven't done very much about implementing it, but at least it is a statutory requirement in most countries of the world, and disabled people have the right to go to law about it. Here, we just have the much weaker equality, which was diluted, I have to say, from the point of view of disabled people. We used to have the public sector disability equality duty. That went because it was broadened to other categories. So we got a lesser enforcement for broadening it out to different groups. And so I'm all for other groups being protected, but why should it have been at the expense of disabled people's rights? Where this is still, as I said towards the beginning, an area which I don't take seriously.
What for you is the most defining moment in disability history that has defined kind of like the disability rights movement that we see today?
Well, in the modern disability movement, I mean, there was an older movement. This movement that we're part of grew up from the 60s, perhaps just before that, with a book called Stigma by Paul Hunt, which informed people and then led to UPIAS and then British Council of Disabled People. That movement did get the 1990 Act, but we had to campaign on the streets. We had an action network chaining themselves to buses and so on. And then it wasn't what we'd asked for. And then we had to campaign, and the Labour government to commit to set up a commission, which it did. And by the 2005 Act, it was 2004, implemented in 2005, nearly all the holes had been filled in. And so there was a period from 2005 to 2010, we more or less had the rights that we wanted. So one could say maybe that was at time. So it was I think, direct action fighting to get the Disability Discrimination Act, even weak as it was, actually shifting an intransigent Tory government. Some people did shift their position, like William Hague, who within the Tories did argue for the legislature. The Tory leadership were not in favour of it. just as they're in favour of implementing the convention a generation later. And I would say an earlier time was the National League of the Blind, who were organised trade union, who affiliated to TUC in the 1880s, who represented blind workers in local workshops, government workshops, local authority workshops, and elsewhere. And they're not being paid the going rate for a job. They were often skilled men doing skilled jobs. And they had a number of strikes. And in the end, they organised a march in 1920 to march from Leeds, Manchester, and from South Wales to London, 20-day march of blind people, and were met in Trafalgar Square by 10,000 people, and then went and saw Lloyd George. They didn't get what they'd asked for, but they did get the first Blind People's Act, which was important. They, that stands out as also something. I think another thing might be the recognition of sign language, which has been in several stages, but only last year coming in. I mean, Tony Blair's government recognised it as well, but they didn't do anything to implement it. I think we've now got a basis for implementing it. We want to see, for instance, British Sign Language on the curriculum in schools, so you can get a GCSE in British Sign Language and so on, that it becomes a normal way of communicating so that deaf young people can be fully included in schools and colleges and universities. So I think that is quite, can be quite a mark. But of course, against the pluses, we've got to put that history of the negatives, which is there. I think the other thing I would say that was probably a high mark of the disability movement was not just the campaigning, but as also the disability arts movement, which paralleled the growth of the disability movement in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and gave people respect as disabled people for their own culture, and the fact that they had we had to create our own culture because we'd been segregated and isolated wherever we were, wherever we grew up. And it was a coming together of people by seeing that actually we're not the problem, you are. And an arts-based movement based on that was very important for a whole generation of young disabled people coming through. It gave them the confidence to actually fight. And I think we need to regenerate